Well, thank you very much for coming. Your attendance at this seminar in no way implies that you are the guys that are plagiarizing, right? So I want you to know that. That's my little joke to begin with. Now, I want to just put this in context. Before I introduce Mark, I want to put this in context. I was looking at the whole issue of plagiarism, knowing that we were going to have this workshop today, and I came across a report from 1999. And this was done by the Center for Academic Integrity at Duke, which is at Duke University, and it's a consortium of 200 colleges and universities who are interested in academic integrity. They did a major survey, and they found that 75% of college students cheat at least once during their academic careers. They also found that 80% of high-achieving college-bound students, so they're from the K-12 system, have cheated and admitted to doing so. At this point, of course, we're talking about 1999 to 2000, so these sites where you can get free academic papers were not as well developed as they are now, but apparently at this time, the average hit rate for these sort of free sites where you can get the papers was something like 80,000 hits per day. Okay, now this is in the United States. I want to say a little bit about the UAE, where I came from. Before I came back to Hong Kong, I was in the United Arab Emirates, and I can tell you that this whole issue of cheating and plagiarism and everything is actually endemic in the UAE, and I wish I could say it was only confined to the students, but it's also unfortunately confined to the faculty too. So it only involves the faculty too. Now in Hong Kong, I think we must be aware that, you know, this is not something which only applies elsewhere. It also applies in Hong Kong. And recently, I was conducting a doctorate of business administration course for a set of senior people who are Hong Kong people, Hong Kong managers, and I had to fail 3 of them for blatant plagiarism. Now these are people who have already taken 4 courses already, and I'm giving the 5th course, so this is something which I think is a very important issue. Closer to home, we recently had, as you know, the QAC audit, and the panelists in the we have an initial indication of their findings. One aspect of their findings is that there seems to be some inconsistency across the faculties in dealing with plagiarism. So, it's in that context that I want to introduce Professor Mark Hampton, who has an interest in this area and has some expertise in this area. So could we please welcome Mark, and I'll hand it over to him.
Okay, so there's another context for today that Jim didn't share that I'll share. And that is when I taught the Common Core class in world history, which I developed and which students still haven't forgiven me for, even though I don't teach it anymore. I had the privilege and the pleasure of teaching 295 students in the same semester from across all faculties. This was half of the sophomore class. I was teaching them at least in lecture, if not also in tutorial. And I discovered as I was looking at the papers just what a high number of plagiarism cases we found. Actually, there were several that might have been borderline that in exercising judgment I was able to say, this seems more like an honest mistake. I'll mark down some points, I'll talk to them. We'll see if it can be a learning experience, full stop. But there were 16 that ultimately I sent to the Student Disciplinary Committee. I think that's how many, I'm going by memory here. But I remember noticing at Senate that even though I had only taught some 3% of the, I should say I had assigned roughly 3% of the grades on campus, somehow I was responsible for 80% of the students who ended up at the Student Disciplinary Committee, because I had like 16 out of 19 or 14 out of 17 or something like that. So instinctively, I'm imagining that this can't be a problem that's only confined to my class, and so I have the hypothesis that maybe I was just paying more attention to it. Maybe some people didn't take as much interest or attention to it. Let me be fully candid here. I was lucky enough to have a PhD student at the time, and he owes service to the department, and I had him put in lots of hours in helping me find these. So it was a labor-intensive job, but it wasn't all my labor. Well, anyway, what I found as I started going around campus and talking, several shocking things. One is that even though we have a university policy, it's not applied evenly. There were plenty of people who would admit to me off the record, and I'm not going to mention any of their names, of course, but there were people who would admit to me off the record, yeah, I've had some students plagiarize, but I handled it myself. Well, there is a university policy involving the disciplinary committee, and I was pointing out to such people that this is actually very important because of issues of fairness. The student who is taken to the student disciplinary committee faces penalties that could end up in expulsion. The student who isn't sent there faces no such penalties, no matter how many times they plagiarize. I also happen to remember my experiences when I first got to Lingnan and talking about a student who had plagiarized, and I had caught her, and I was telling this to my colleagues, and my colleagues said, oh yeah, she did it in my class last semester. Oh yeah, mine too. And so this was a repeat offender, but I had no knowledge of this. So to me, it's very important that different people are being treated differently. Some may face expulsion, which is a very bad thing. Some may not, for fundamentally the same problem. Then I also found, though, that as I started talking to various colleagues, they said, no, my Turnitin numbers were fine, so I didn't have any plagiarism. And then it occurs to me, we have people who don't actually know how Turnitin actually works, because if they did, they would realize that what they just said to me is absurd, because that's just not what Turnitin does. So anyway, in my capacity as undergraduate studies director of the arts faculty, I discussed this with the then Associate Vice President for Quality Assurance, Meta, Professor Hjort, and I ended up putting a proposal forth to AQAC about, well, we need to do something and I'm not sure what. So we slightly tightened up the policy here at the university as far as what, I should say, the language about what constitutes plagiarism. That was passed by Senate recently. The working group on assessment thought about different things that could be done. Ultimately, one of the things is seminars, a series of maybe educational opportunities for faculty. And since I was the one who had raised this issue in the first place, when Professor Sharma asked me if I would do this, I could not decently say no. So here I am. So that's why I'm the one talking about this today. So the overview of today, and I've already talked about some of this, I've already kind of gone over the problem. I also want to, I've kind of organized 3 myths about plagiarism that I'd like to identify, articulate, and then kind of expose as myths. Let me mention at this point, although I hope we have plenty of time at the end for further discussions, if anything I'm saying is unclear or provocative, you have questions, comments, please stop me at any time along the way. No reason to save it to the end. Please stop me anytime. My goal my personal goal regarding the university, and I do have some, this is sort of my bailiwick within the arts faculty because of my associate dean position. My goal is not a negative goal. I'm not negatively trying to stop plagiarism and certainly not catch violators. That's not it at all. I'd really like the positive goal to inculcate correct understanding and habits. And let me pause here just to mention that it's exactly this reason, my emphasis on the positive, not the negative, although it may not seem like that during part of today. But my emphasis on the positive instead of the negative, if I may say something a little bit out of school that Max will probably have to edit out later, is that this is exactly why when I apply for a research grant and ORS asks me, Did you run it through the plagiarism software? I say, no, of course not. If I plagiarized, I would know it. I do not need software to tell me I plagiarized. So no, I did not run it through the software. Because it's irrelevant what the number says I did or didn't do. I know I sat in my office and I did the work. If you guys have to do it, I understand that's the policy. But again, emphasize the positive. I have personally good habits about doing my work academically honestly, and I'd like my students to as well. Now, my goal for today, in this next half hour or so, is not to say anything particularly profound. And so if you want something profound, maybe you should just leave, because I probably won't provide it. But really what I'd like to do is articulate a few aspects of the problem, the issues, offer just a little bit of a technical demonstration with the promise that I will be happy to show you more personally if you'd like it. And also hopefully open up a conversation about how the university can handle this better. Now, let me get right into the myths. And this one is one that primarily I hear from students. And I indicate it because I've heard it many, many times from students. And although you never can be sure that when a student says one thing or another, they're actually telling you the truth because of communication issues or whatever, I've actually heard several students tell me that they heard this from a professor. And maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But if they did, that's quite alarming. But this is one that comes from students primarily. That is, they'll say, hey, as long as I change it into my own words, by definition, it's not plagiarism. They'll say that. A variation on it, and I've heard this 8 or 9 times in the last 2 years. Students will tell me this is the rule that I've been told. The definition of plagiarism is 5 consecutive words copied directly without quotation marks or attribution. That's the definition of plagiarism. Again, this is a myth and a variation on that myth. Correction. And this is now very clearly reflected in our university statement about what plagiarism it is. Also, we have a website that links to a couple of American websites that indicate full or more full definitions of what plagiarism is. Plagiarism can, in fact, involve the appropriation of someone else's words without attribution, but also their ideas without attribution. If you take somebody's ideas, you should be citing. Not all of our students know this. And I hope everybody in the room knows this, but even if you know this, you should be aware that a lot of our students don't know this. And again, I say this as somebody who taught half of the sophomore class in a single semester and had a lot of conversations with the students who did not know this, and I was convinced they did not know this. Changing it into your own words, that is paraphrasing or even summarizing, does not obviously eliminate the need to identify your sources. Okay? Myth number 2. And this one I'm going to give you a little bit of a demonstration on here. This one I have heard from faculty members. Faculty members have said, what do you mean? Footnotes can't be plagiarized. Footnotes are how you know it's not plagiarized. So if there's a clear footnote or a clear parenthetical citation, if you do APA or MLA or whatever, then that means it's not plagiarism. That's definitional. That's axiomatic. But again, that's a myth. In fact, and I've seen this over and over and over again, students routinely plagiarize the footnotes themselves or the bibliographies. And just in case there's any confusion, this is a demonstration I often do in my class because I spend time explaining to them why you're not allowed to do this. I will say, so for example, can you guys read this okay? I don't know if it's a Word document. I just sort of created a paper here, but I didn't try to write the whole thing. My paper about Churchill by student. In 1933, Winston Churchill, yada yada, 350 more words about Churchill, yada yada. So in conclusion, Churchill, yada yada. Okay, so let's say that the student in question, it's a made up student, but I've seen this all the time. The student has gotten this from one source, let's say. Maybe the student has gotten this from Wikipedia, maybe they've gotten it from an encyclopedia, a hard copy, probably not. Maybe they've gotten it from a Chinese book and they've translated it themselves, but all the ideas are from another source. But the student knows very clearly the professor needs me to have some footnotes, otherwise I'll get a low grade. So what am I going to do? Well, okay, I'll add a footnote right here. That's good. I don't know if you can see, but I've added a footnote right there. So right there, add a footnote. Now, but I need something for the footnote. All right, I'll go to the Wikipedia page. That's the article on Winston Churchill. Go down to the footnotes. See, I've highlighted this here. Now, boom, I have a footnote. That happens all the time. Okay, so just because you see a footnote, don't imagine that that means, number one, the student ever looked at that source. Don't even imagine unless you actually assign the material yourself or you know the actual source in question. Don't even imagine that what's in that source actually says anything about that paragraph. I mean, they may have just found an article or book about Winston Churchill and put it there. If it's a research paper, they figure you've got 50 students. You're never going to read it all, if they even think that far. Okay? So that's one thing. Keep going. Now I need a bibliography. Where do I get a bibliography? Well, luckily, the same Wikipedia article, highlight that. Boom, now I have a bibliography. Again, I've seen it a lot of times. Okay? And again, let me just sort of mention, because I'm going to get into Turnitin in a few minutes, but this is exactly the kind of thing that the Turnitin is likely not to tell you, or it won't necessarily end up in a high, what's the word, a high similarity index. It won't necessarily give you a high similarity index. Now, in fact, one of the filters that you can use in Turnitin is to exclude bibliographic material, because a lot of people would think, well, that's just the bibliographic material. That's not what I'm interested in. I don't want the similarity index to be artificially high, so I'll exclude it. But what if the bibliography itself is plagiarized? Well, even if you don't exclude it, you just see, oh, it's a bibliography. Maybe you don't really pay attention. But the point is, Turnitin is not going to help you out here. Okay? Yes, Robin.
It could do, because if you include the bibliography, and it should get highlighted,
right.
I guess, right?
That's true.
But if the source is the same for each of the items in the bibliography,
right.
then that's a clue.
The extreme case I just gave you should result in a large highlighted field. Okay. Now, if the student has any more subtlety than that, because that was a long bibliography in Turnitin, in Wikipedia, if the student had highlighted 2 of them and then skipped about 5 and highlighted 2 more and then skipped about 5, copy and pasted that way, then all you'd see was that a lot of different fairly common sources appear in another source. That wouldn't by itself tip you off that anything had gone wrong. In fact, a lot of student papers will look like that without it being plagiarism. My point is, Turnitin doesn't tell you one way or the other. All it tells you is that it matches something else. It doesn't tell you what to do about it or whether that's innocent or problematic. Does that make sense?
Could do, yeah.
Yeah. Now let me be clear here, because I think I already said a little bit about this. In some cases, the student may actually steal a correct footnote that actually matches the information that it's supposed to be matching, but they still stole it because they never even slightly glanced at that source. They just found the source and put it where it belongs. In other cases, though, like I said, it may just be some article or book about Churchill, and because they said something about Churchill, they just put it there. It may not even have anything to do with the actual content of their paper. That really happens, okay? And Turnitin won't tell you that in particular. Myth number 3. And this one might actually get a little controversial, but I hope I can make my case here. No, I'm sorry. Actually, let me go back before I get to myth number 3. I apologize. The point of what I was just trying to say is the student in question, and this student is a made-up student. I've just made this one up. Whether the student knows it or not, this is a key point. They may not know they've done anything wrong if it's not been explained to them very carefully. If they're in an upper-level history class, I promise you they know they've done wrong because Professor Pianciola pounds it into them at the beginning of our program. But if I have a student who's not from my major, I don't know what they know or what they don't know. They may or may not know. Whether he or she knows it, the student is at least arguably in the question of the bibliography, and absolutely of the sources in the footnotes. The student is claiming to have consulted materials they never consulted. They're claiming ownership of knowledge they never acquired other than by taking it from some other place. The student in question is just an example, but this has happened in my office many times over the last 3 years. When I speak to the student in my office, eventually the student admits to me that, yes, I never even approximately looked at the source in question. I didn't look at it in hard copy. I didn't look at it online. I simply never looked at it. The students eventually, so you have to talk to the students and actually find out what's going on. Sometimes, and this is where it gets a little bit comical, and my former colleague, Professor Fichter, was one who actually enjoyed doing this. I don't. But sometimes the student will have found a source that has never been published. For the student to have consulted it, they would have had to have gone to visit an archive located in Glasgow, Scotland over the weekend. And so, Professor Fichter would ask them, so how was Scotland? And they would say, well, I didn't go to Scotland. Sometimes that's a real giveaway, but other times it's just a book, it's an article, it's something they could have found online. The question is, did they look at it or not? And often the answer is no. Now, obviously, and please forgive me, I know this is very basic, but ethically what the student needs to have done, as I explained to the student should have said, this says here, Yasha Bereziner, article, Brother Winston Churchill's a Freemason. The student needed to have said, as cited in Wikipedia, or wherever. But if the student, I tell the student that, and the students will say to me with a very refreshing earnestness and naivete, but I thought that if I did that, then you would give me a lower grade because my whole paper's from Wikipedia. And I said, yes, you would have gotten a lower grade, but you would not be going to the disciplinary committee. Citing Wikipedia and citing it, honestly, is not an ethical violation. It may be a bad paper. It will be a bad paper if your whole paper is from one source, but it's not an ethical violation. So I say, you've chosen the ethical violation over the honesty, which is what you should have chosen, but what you should have done is just actually write the paper, right? That's what you should have done. Now, Turnitin is likely, again, to filter this example, but as Professor Snell and I were just discussing, a lot depends on how you use the filtering. Do you include or exclude bibliography? And then what do you do with the highlight itself? That will still depend on you, the professional. The software won't solve it for you. And that leads to the third myth, actually. The Turnitin similarity index tells us something important. By itself, actually, the similarity index doesn't tell us anything that's that important. A variation, and this one is from real conversations I've had, both with faculty members and also faculty members in their capacity as faculty members, but also with the student disciplinary committee. And now the variation is, well, not only does the similarity index tell us something important, but it makes sense for a department or a faculty to devise a policy that a similarity index of, say, X, whatever, 20%, 25%, whatever it is, that will be our formal rule for what constitutes plagiarism. And I actually had the experience that when I submitted a bunch of cases to the Student Disciplinary Committee, the secretary of the committee writes back to me and says, does your department have a rule about what the similarity index is that equals plagiarism? And I said, no, of course we don't, because that would be useless information. So of course that's not going to be our policy. And I'm going to explain this with some illustrations here that are actually real ones. But the correction is, the similarity index only identifies exact word matches or phrase matches. It doesn't tell you about paraphrases. It doesn't tell you about summaries. So if the student paraphrases or summarizes the ideas, they put it in their own words, it doesn't tell you that. It also does not catch translations. That should be obvious, but just in case you're not aware, it does happen that students will find a book in Chinese about the same topic as your assignment in English, and they will just copy it into their own words, which is a very useful skill that I wish I had, but it's not the skill in question, and it is an ethical violation. It's not their work. The translation is their work, but what they're translating, they should be giving credit to, is my point. And here's another part of the correction. I've seen a really high similarity index that when I started unpacking it, this is what happened. A significant number of exact word matches are absolutely innocent. For example, in this article, the author argues that you probably are aware that we academics have a lot of conventional usages in our own jargon, whatever, or just conventional phrasing. But it happens that most of our students don't use exactly the kind of language we use, but every now and then one will. And I had a score that came to almost 30%. And I start clicking on these links, and it was just things like this, right? And when I look to see where they got it from, so the student is writing they're writing something about World War II for me, and I click, and they've got exactly this phrase in this article. The author argues that. I wonder where they stole that from. Click, I look, Nature magazine. It's about how the dodo bird went extinct or something bizarre. So, obviously I use my common sense. It's not that the student, oh, I've got a brilliant idea, but I need a phrase. I better go look at Nature magazine and find it. Obviously, that's just a conventional usage. But my point is, students who have kind of, and we do get students like this, and this was a Hong Kong student, writing very much like a native-speaking English academic. There were simply about 25% worth of things just like this. So if anybody ever had an idea of just lazily looking at the similarity index, please don't, because this is exactly what can happen. Now, I will also pause and say this is another reason why I never put the setting on to let the student see the similarity index. There's a couple reasons. One, of course, is I'd rather emphasize the positive. I'd rather emphasize have good habits, right? But if a student is trying to get away with something, it would be kind of like if I asked a shop in Central now can I see what is being caught on the security camera so I know if I've been shoplifting? No, I mean, just don't do what is considered shoplifting and you'll be okay. But then the other thing is I think I know our students well enough that they would focus on the number, especially if you allow them to look at the similarity index and you have a departmental policy, they'll just be trying to fix the number. And so this will involve two things. Number one, students who genuinely are plagiarizing, you'll help them get away with it because they'll just change a few words. Then you'll never know where they got it from, and they'll plagiarize successfully, not by plagiarizing words, but by plagiarizing ideas. But then secondly, some perfectly innocent students will start changing phrases like this just to make their score lower because, oh my gosh, I didn't think I cheated, but my score is high. I'd better lower it. So this is a reason why I don't set it so that students can see it. I don't treat Turnitin per se as a teachable opportunity. It's just a tool for me. I don't use it to teach the students. But anyway, that's a side note. Again, the correction being the similarity index only helps you with exact word matches, not with paraphrases, etc. Also, a lot of what it'll catch is absolutely innocent. So the conclusion here, sadly, Turnitin will not spare you from exercising subjective professional judgment. That is still something you have to do. Turnitin does not solve that problem. Now, maybe 5-10 years from now it will, because artificial intelligence, more and more sophisticated. Turnitin does not do that. Turnitin is just logarithms and matches, and it won't, at this stage, solve this problem for you. You still have to exercise your own subjective professional judgment. Let me clarify, not intended as a slam on Turnitin, and I was a little bit worried when I saw the poster that had Turnitin at the top of it, because my point is not really to attack Turnitin, and I'll say actually, I believe my department was the first one to use it at Lingnan, because I believe for a couple of years the university bought us a license that was only for us, and the rest of the university didn't have it, and it was introduced later. But over the years, my colleagues and I in the history department have, through hard-won knowledge, learned about a lot of the limitations it has and how you actually can't simply rely on it. And I want to give just a few examples here, and I'm almost to the end here. But now you're not going to be able to read this, but I'm going to kind of just highlight what the points are here. Ideally, I'd like to be able to open up one of my Turnitin assignments and actually work through it. Maybe it would have been possible, but I can't figure out any way to do it without the student's name appearing, and I can't do that. So what I've done is I've done a screenshot, and the student's name is under that black right there. If anybody is intrigued by any of this but thinks they need to hear more and you'd like me, I'd be happy to come to your office, look at your own assignments with you, work through how you use the software if anybody wants that. If you don't, that's fine too. But I just want to kind of highlight a few points here. This one, can you guys see the similarity index up at the top? 33. Now, I've already excluded the quoted and excluded the bibliography. Before I did that, it was 35. But when you exclude those two things, not a lot. It went out from 35 to 33. This is not a very good paper. C minus maybe. I mean, it's not a good paper. But despite the 35% that got knocked down to 33, I mean, that's 33 with the quoted and the bibliography excluded. It's not plagiarized. Now, that number, you better believe it made me look really closely, but I can't find any reason to suspect it of plagiarism once I've looked very closely through it. Let me tell you what's actually happened here. Really weird things, actually, but first of all, and now you can actually change whether it's showing the matches one at a time or showing a composite list of all the matches. Here I'm showing the matches one at a time. And it's like 17% matches one source. Well, it also says 17% matches a different source, 16%, 16%, indicating, of course, that whatever the source is, that's probably the same source that appears on many different websites, which is possible. There's a lot of things like that. But 17% from one source. That sounds like plagiarism, but here's what happens. To be honest, if I had just written a very short report to the Student Disciplinary Committee and said, according to Turnitin, there's a 17% match of exact wording from one source, and I'd left it at that, I bet I could have gotten that student demerits. And that would have been a tragedy because this student did not plagiarize whatever else she did, okay? First of all, what happened is, even though I excluded quoted, the student sometimes used double quotations and sometimes used single quotations. I mean, in a very unsystematic way. Now, the student should correct that. That's not what you're supposed to do, but that's not an ethical violation. That's not a reason to send them to the disciplinary committee. All of these quotations here are in single quotes. For whatever reason, Turnitin didn't filter that out, even though I said filter out the quotations. But then it turns out that all these quotes are what is matching up with 17%, you know. So still, that's a lot, but the point is, it is in quotation marks, and then there's a footnote there that says number 11. Somewhere down below, there's a footnote. So it's cited, it's in quotation marks. What's the problem? Well, it's a really high score, but the definition of plagiarism is not getting a high score on Turnitin. That's not the definition of plagiarism, right? What actually happened is, because this is an ancient history where we use the Bible as a primary source, what happened is the whole Bible is available on the internet. All of these sources are from the Old Testament of the Bible, so every one of them matches the same source. But that's innocent. That's just, it's not a great paper, as I said, but it's perfectly innocent. There's nothing that's been done wrong here. It's correctly cited, it's in quotation marks, it's fine. It's a high score, 30 quotations, 17% match to one source, that's innocent, okay? This one's a little bit different. This one here, this is 18%, but then when you, what did I exclude first? I excluded the bibliography, it drops to 15%. I then exclude quoted, it's all the way down to 12%, but still 12% could easily be plagiarism, and that's an eighth of the paper. This one is not plagiarism either, okay? As I start to look at it, well, almost all of it, well, first of all, nothing's matching a huge amount. So even if they plagiarize from multiple sources, okay? Even if they plagiarize from multiple sources, not 17% from one place. But again, they didn't plagiarize. It turns out almost all of the matches are long phrases, but the phrase is nothing more than a correct citation of a source that many other people have correctly cited at various times and places in history, and it's available on the internet. Now, I've already told you that this could be plagiarized in one way or another. Maybe they just copy and pasted that from somewhere Turnitin doesn't tell you that. In this case, I had to use my subjective professional judgment, like always, and it was clear to me that this was not an example of plagiarism. This is an example of, yes, the student very clearly engaged with these sources. Yes, the student convinced me that she had really looked at those books and looked at those articles and had actively engaged with them. The match is perfectly innocent. It's just a routine match. Again, anybody in this room, if you were to open it up and start looking at it, I think you'd come to the exact same conclusion as me. I promised you I would be saying nothing profound here. But the point is, you can't look at the score of 33 or even the score of 12 and say, oh, that's alarming. You actually have to look at what it actually does, okay? Now, this one is the last one I'll show you. I can't go to Turnitin, unfortunately, because this is clearly the one I had to use, but unfortunately I can't access the Turnitin anymore because it's been a few years. I have the original paper, though, because I always grade all of my papers online, but I don't grade them in Turnitin. I download them and I grade them in Word so that I can put comments in the margins, because my handwriting is really, really terrible. And also, I don't want to waste a lot of paper. But the result of that is I have all of the papers for many, many years to come, and I could go back and reassess them for whatever reason many years in the future. This one also, though, went to the Student Disciplinary Committee. And for that reason, I also have the hard copy where I wrote notes, and I have the report I sent to the Student Disciplinary Committee. I remembered it well, and especially once I got into it again, I really remember it well. I'm going to show you what happened, and at first this won't necessarily seem that alarming, but my point here is that it's comprehensive. It's the whole paper. Let's just look at a couple of these here. I'll read them out loud. I don't know, can you see this at all? It's a little bigger. Now this sounds very much like student writing. Not our best students either. Okay students, but not our best students. This was in the Common Core class. And let me just make it clear, the students had been given a very bounded assignment. It had one assigned reading that I had assigned. It's a very simple reading. And this book chapter compared Hitler and Stalin. It's a very simple chapter, just not very many pages long. They were supposed to find, I think, 2 scholarly journal articles from any discipline, okay, any discipline. And they were supposed to integrate what they'd read that was assigned, and we had discussed it in class, integrate that with a couple of other readings in order to produce a relatively high-level learning outcome for us here. Now, this is clearly not stealing anybody's words. Appraised as the culprit of Nazi Germany, World War II and the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler, 20 April 1889 to 30 April 1945, became infatuated with warfare after reading a picture book from his father, which is about the Franco-Prussian War. So you see, not perfect grammar or anything like that. It looks like student writing. It doesn't necessarily look plagiarized. I'm about to show you something that I didn't immediately find. I'm going to show you as I'd like to present it to you. I'm not going to show it to you as I discovered it. I'll tell you in a minute how I discovered it. But just let me point out that here on Wikipedia, in the 1-to-1, I wrote those ones because I had a bunch of numbers, like 6, 7, 8, 9. I don't know how many points I made, but I was trying to show the disciplinary committee that it was through and through. This says Hitler, he, became fixated on warfare after finding a picture book about the Franco-Prussian War among his father's belongings. Again, the wording that the student had said was, after reading a picture book from his father, which is about the Franco-Prussian War in his childhood. Okay, that's clearly his own words. No issue there. And if this was just that one sentence, because after all, there's a footnote. The footnote points to a source that definitely said that stuff. I'm sure I would have let that pass or maybe not even noticed anything about it. The problem is the preponderance, the recurrence, the over and over and over again. All of the sentences are not particularly from what's in the source, in the footnote. They're all from the same Wikipedia article. Now again, it's footnoted correctly. I mean, if you look at that number 1, that number 1 refers to Mein Kampf, Hitler's big book. And that probably really is in Mein Kampf. But again, the student never looked at Mein Kampf. In a minute, you'll see how I know this. Well, eventually I know it because I asked him and he told me. But again, in and of itself, that first example, you could easily say, oh, well, it looks correct. It looks correct. It's a footnote. It's a correct source. Number 2, after Edmund's death, oh, I'm just making sure I'm giving you the right, yeah, this is the right one. After Edmund's death, a few months later, Hitler was sent to a secondary school in Linz called Realschule by his father, despite it was rebelled against by Hitler. Now here it says, ignoring his son's desire to attend a classical high school and become an artist, in September 1900, Alois sent Hitler to the Realschule, blah, blah, blah. Hitler rebelled against his father, initially did poorly in school. Okay, now, so again, it's a sentence by sentence. The words have all been changed, but it's the same content. Now, I'm not going to show you the other 7 or 8 or however many there are, but I want you to just trust me that I could, and they're there, and I did send all that to the Student Disciplinary Committee. Now, the point is, and this is what's brilliant in a way, and this is why Turnitin is not going to help you. This one actually got a fairly low Turnitin score, well under 10%. Okay, well under 10%. This, number 4, is to this footnote, 3 and 4, cite a source where this information is clearly to be found, and it's not Wikipedia. This number 1 cites a different source where that information is clearly to be found, and it's not Wikipedia. But the student took that information, that footnote, that information, that footnote from the exact same Wikipedia article and proceeded to do the whole paper that way. And it does not show up on Turnitin as a high violation or anything like that. It did show up with one paragraph that was clearly taken from what looked like Wikipedia unattributedly, and that's what prompted me, with a very low score, to actually print out the Wikipedia article and sit it side by side and go down the line. And it was clear that what the student had done is just lift it straight from Wikipedia and put it into his own words. And so, again, Hitler, a biography, Kershaw, Ian, 2008. Well, that's another thing that kind of gives it away. If the student had been a little bit more clever, the student might have put it into a more straightforward, usually in a footnote it doesn't appear quite the same as this. This was an unconventional way that Wikipedia did it. If the student had changed it around, you know what, I'm sorry, I'm speaking out of school here. That's exactly what happened. The student did switch it around from the Wikipedia way, put it into what I think the student thought was the correct way, and that's why this itself doesn't match up to Wikipedia by Turnitin. So Turnitin didn't flag this either because the words were reversed in reverse order. So in other words, the student is taking the exact citation that was in Wikipedia, but switching the order. So it says, instead of saying Ian Kershaw, comma, Hitler biography, it says it the other way around. That does not show up on Turnitin. Now, I'm not suggesting the student was clever enough to figure out how to game Turnitin. That's not my point. But my point is the information is straight off of Wikipedia. Turnitin doesn't catch it because it's in reverse. Does that make sense? OK. But again, what the student has done is systematically go, not quite line by line, but kind of like page by page, and take one sentence and turn it into exactly one sentence that in content exactly matches the Wikipedia sentence, just the words are changed, okay? So it's exactly a one-to-one correspondence in content, sentence by sentence, and the footnote. What the footnote, the number 4 is matching up to where it says superscript number 4 in the text. Well, that's exactly the same footnote the Wikipedia used to make exactly that same point. Again, 1 or 2 I probably won't think anything about. At least I won't send it to the Student Disciplinary Committee. When they've done this for an entire paper, it's a clear case. The Student Disciplinary Committee had no trouble believing that either. And the student, like I said, I talked to the student before I sent it. But again, Turnitin did not catch this. So Turnitin gives me a 35% that gets knocked down to 33%. Totally innocent, although not a great paper. Turnitin gives me not really much indication that this very clear-cut case of cheating is in fact cheating. Again, professional judgment is required. You can't depend on the software to do it. But just to reiterate a point that may have gotten lost in the shuffle, this was a tightly bounded assignment. All the student was supposed to be doing was giving me 2 scholarly journal articles plus a source that had already been assigned and discussed in class. That's it, 3 sources. It's a Common Core class. It's not a big research paper. And yet the student has all of these sources. This student who, in fact, rarely came to class, he was in my tutorial group, never came to class really, was already destined to fail the class because of just not ever coming to class and doing very badly on the exams, but thought that to add a little bit of insult to the injury of already failing, the student would give me a paper with, I don't know, 15 sources, and I'm supposed to believe that the student really read all those books. Well, again, Turnitin didn't help me with this. I'll also say that I have had cases where I've given these very tightly bounded assignments, and students I normally think of as very, very, very good students have done the same thing when clearly they didn't have to. And I pull them in my office and I say, look, why did you do that? Why? And they say, well, I wanted to impress you with how much work I had done. And I said, okay, that's good, but number 1, you don't get extra points for doing extra work because this is the assignment. And number 2, you didn't do the extra work, you took it off of Wikipedia. And then the students, you say, yes, that was a bad judgment on my part. Okay, well, I'm going to sort of wrap up here by recapping and then maybe saying just 1 or 2 things about where do we go from here. So just to recap, and I'm just going to go right through it because it's already been said, there is certainly plagiarism occurring that is not noticed at this university. And not only is this my anecdotal experience and my experience of talking to a lot of students and all that, but if we only really had 4 cases that were other than my class, then we would be so far out of the norm of what Jim Pounder has been telling us. Yeah, that's an American problem, it's a UAE problem, it's not a Hong Kong problem. Now, does anybody here really believe that that's the more likely explanation? I don't. We do certainly have plagiarism occurring that is not noticed. And I hope I've shown you some of the reasons it may not be getting noticed, especially if you rely on Turnitin. Noticed plagiarism at this university is treated unevenly in ways that, I should have said ways that are unfair, pardon my grammar there, in ways that are unfair to students. And this is despite the fact that we do have a very obvious and clear university policy. It's just not being applied evenly. And again, it's the unfairness that I'm highlighting here, that one student is possibly facing expulsion, another student it gets handled internally. It's not clear that everyone on campus fully understands what plagiarism is, and Turnitin will not solve your problems. Okay? Yes? Yes? One of my key points is to not think that Turnitin has done your job for you. That's one of my key points. Now, I never used Turnitin until I came to Lingnan, and well, sorry, I was at HKU for a semester in 2006, and we used Turnitin there. But I taught for almost a decade in the United States, and I caught plagiarism without Turnitin. Suspicious phrases. You put them into Google, you see if it matches up to anything. You open the books that the students have consulted, things like that. There's whole other areas that I didn't actually go over today, which is sometimes Turnitin will reveal that the student, in a work the student cited, the student simply used a lot of the same words as the author but didn't put them in quotation marks. Now that I've tended to treat a little bit more innocently, like a mistake, because clearly the student has not deliberately stolen from the author and told me where I can find it, like on purpose. Do you know what I'm saying? A student, if they were stealing, wouldn't deliberately tell me where to find it so I could catch them. That I don't send to the disciplinary committee because it's a very different kind of thing. But that could lead to a high Turnitin score. But I caught that all the time before Turnitin even existed, right? Or before I had access to Turnitin. As far as previous years go, yeah, 1 year has to be the first year, that's true. But the upside is that even if you had a high Turnitin score, it wouldn't necessarily mean that it was plagiarism, so you'd still have to do the work, right? But it is more work, which is why if we can actually get an environment in which students are not routinely doing this, it should be less work for everybody and also a happier result. And I just had a few, like, what are the solutions? And notice I put a question mark here. Number one, and the most important one, I'm open to suggestions because I really don't have the answers to this. I mean, not at all, because I'm still working at the level of catching students. I really want to get it to the level of students are doing the right thing uniformly. That's really what I'd like to get it to. How do you convince students of that? Well, one thing that does come to mind, and I've had a lot of very fruitful conversations with Professor Livingston along these lines and what kind of assignments he gives, devise assignments that have very specific focuses for which it will be difficult, if not impossible, to find any ready-made material to copy. A student may still plagiarize, but when a student plagiarizes and what they've plagiarized has absolutely no connection whatsoever to the actual question they've been given, well, that's not going to help them anyway. So maybe they're less likely to do that. But there are ways to devise assignments, and open-ended research papers are not the assignments that this applies to. But there are specific focused assignments that it's very difficult for this to even become an issue. And then secondly, and this is something I think we can't get away from, it's not enough to simply give them a speech during orientation, which none of us probably actually go to, and we don't really know what they tell them at orientation. It's not enough even to make them sign a piece of paper saying, I understand all the policies and I'm not going to do it. You actually need to devote significant amounts of class time to teaching what is meant by academic honesty. That's the only way to really get it done. It's not going to catch everything, but it will help at least with the students who are the honest mistake students, the students who didn't mean to plagiarize. And I do think there is a lot of that going on where students don't even really realize that it's wrong. And so I've done exactly that demonstration with students where I copy. I actually show them the mechanics. Here I'm highlighting from Wikipedia. Copy the footnotes. Here I'm pasting. Because when I said, you can plagiarize footnotes, it's actually plagiarism. They say, really? But footnote, it's axiomatic, right? If it's got footnotes, it's not plagiarism. That's the definition of plagiarism. And I say, no, watch this. Click, click. And I see the little light bulbs go off over their head. They're like, oh, yes, I see what you've done. Yes, you've falsely claimed to have used those sources, but all you've done is copy and paste. Yeah, that's plagiarism. Now, those students will not innocently do that, I think. They may still do it maliciously with ill intent, but at least maybe that'll help with the ones who honestly didn't know. You can't just tell them once and expect that it's solved. You actually have to do demonstrations. So that's all I've got. But
Thank you.
when Grace asked me if I wanted to do it for an hour or an hour and a half, I said, let's try to make it an hour, but I'm not going to be in a hurry. I'll stick around if anybody wants to talk to me informally.
And
Okay.
I'm just aware that people have come for an hour now. I think that what we've got a lot of, we could have carried on. There's no doubt about it, we could have carried on. And I'm sure that Mark will be available to discuss this here, probably, and also in terms of emailing and so on. But I just want to sort of round up with one thing that I did discover, and this was something where the students were blaming the professors for plagiarism. And
Wow.
The three reasons they gave why the professors were to blame. One is they gave general assignments which were easy to plagiarize. Second, because we want to look at ways in which we can perhaps do our bit, right? I mean, we can't justify a statement that professors are to blame for plagiarism. But we can look at what they're saying. One is general assignments. I think you've raised that point in your second point on there. The second thing is insufficient time. That professors give insufficient time, so that means that the student is looking for a way of getting the assignment in, and what better way than to lift from here and lift from there and so on. And the third aspect, which I think is where Winnie's point is well taken, and I'm sure we understand that, is lack of interest in grading the paper. Those were the three things that students said was the reason why they plagiarized.
They
Those three things.
feel like the professor isn't going to show any real interest in the grading?
So it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's right. So anyway, I think that's as far as we can go now, given the time. Thank you very much for attending. Please feel free to contact, I'm saying that on his behalf, but I know he's...
Yeah, absolutely.
Please feel free to contact Mark on this, and you can contact me too, and we'll sort of filter something together. Remember, it's not just an academic issue we're talking about. We've been actually picked up on this by our QAC audit. So let's be aware of this and let's try and do something about it. Okay? Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.